Why was the radio calling her dead when her heart was still pounding? Avery Rogers pressed her cheek against the jagged stone, feeling the sharp edge cut into her skin, but it was nothing compared to the burn in her lungs. The rock smelled of blood, hers and others. The static on her headset hissed, then broke into a voice cold, official, final. No signs of life at coordinates. Operative presumed KIA, 29 years old, female, dark blonde hair, confirmed down. Her death was being recorded even as her pulse hammered. She should have laughed, but her throat was too dry. They had written her name into silence, buried her in words before the ground could take her. But the enemy cheering in the valley below didn't know the truth. And her own command, her brothers, her team, the Navy SEALs who had trained beside her, didn't know either. They thought the mountainside ambush had ended her story. They thought a fall 30 feet into a ravine had taken her life. They were wrong. Avery had survived worse. And what they couldn't see was the flicker inside her, that small, stubborn flame that refused to let go, that told her she wasn't finished yet. If anything, being declared dead had set her free. The rocks around her vibrated faintly as the celebration roared from the compound below. Enemy fighters fired rifles into the air, their voices echoing up through the valley, confident, triumphant. They thought the ghost that had stalked them for 3 weeks was gone. The American infiltrator who had cost them men, time, and secrecy was finished. They had no idea what was coming. For Avery, there was no longer a need to minimize casualties. No more rules of engagement holding her back. No orders telling her to pull punches. Her so-called death had stripped away the last restraint. Now she could fight with the kind of ruthless clarity she had always been trained for but never allowed to unleash. And she intended to. Her fingers flexed against the rough grip of her empty HK-416. The rifle was spent, its magazine long since bled dry in the firefight that had stretched across 2 ridges. She had counted her last rounds carefully, taking men down only when it kept her alive. But ammunition had a way of disappearing faster than hope. Now, only a knife, 2 grenades, and a fatting strength remained. The memory of the ambush played itself again in her head, sharp and vivid. Dawn had barely broken when she noticed it. Too many shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. She had spent 21 days mapping their routines, their blind spots, their careless habits. But this morning everything was off. Men moved like hunters. Their formation was too tight, their steps too measured. She had felt the shift before she'd seen the rifles, and by then it was already too late. The first bullet cracked the rock a breath from her temple. She dove, rolled, her rifle up, firing before she fully knew where the threat was. A shadow crumpled. Another rose. More came. 20 against 1. Terrain that belonged to them. Paths that led nowhere but into their waiting rifles. She had fired, moved, fired again, running on instinct and training. Fire and movement, the endless drill that SEALs lived by. The mountain had answered with thunder. Every step had been paid for with sweat and blood, and still she had kept going. 2 hours of running combat. Her body bruised from the fall into the ravine, her arm torn open by shrapnel. But she had kept going. Until the radio told her to stop. Nightfall 7, this is Overwatch. Extraction delayed. Hostile air activity overhead. Hold position, maintain concealment. She had pressed her headset tighter, ducked behind stone as bullets tore dirt into her mouth. Overwatch, this is Nightfall 7. Active engagement, 20 hostiles cannot hold position, moving to alternate extraction. The voice had come back clipped, cold. Negative, Nightfall 7. Area compromised, stay in position, we will reach you. Stay, while 20 rifles herded her into the kill zone, while her ammo dwindled like the last drips of water in a canteen. Orders were one thing, reality another. Avery had been trained to follow commands, but she had also been trained to survive. And she had chosen survival. Now, as the mountain wind licked her bloodied cheek, she let herself feel the weight of that choice. She was cut off, officially dead, Every decision she made from this moment belonged only to her. No support, no command, no rescue, just her against a valley of men whose only language was death. Her eyes closed for a moment, but not from weakness, from memory. Faces flickered: her father, proud and silent, the Navy veteran who had never said "I love you" but had shown it in every scar he let her see. Her mother, crying the day Avery announced she was going into special operations. And her team, the dozen men who had treated her like a sister, a rival, a soldier they respected even if they never said it aloud. Would they grieve? Or would they accept the report, fold it away like every other KIA, and move on? She couldn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to. The truth that did matter was this: she had intelligence the world couldn't afford to lose. The compound below wasn't just a nest of fighters. It was the nerve center of something larger: plans that stretched across borders, across continents. She had seen enough to know their ambitions weren't just about guns and bombs. They wanted chaos. They wanted terror carved into airports, schools, markets, cities full of people who thought they were safe. If she waited for rescue, those plans would continue. If she followed orders, thousands would die. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It wasn't prayer. It wasn't a curse. It was the decision sealing itself inside her chest. She would finish the mission, alone, or she would bleed into this mountain trying. A dry laugh scraped her throat as she reached for the knife strapped to her chest. In training, instructors had told her there would be a day when she would have to stop being a soldier and become a survivor. But none of them had explained what came after that. None of them had said what it meant to keep fighting when even your own people thought you were dead. Maybe they hadn't known. Maybe no one could. She shifted against the rock, wincing as her shoulder screamed from the earlier fall. Her body was battered, but her eyes burned steady. The sky above was pale blue, the kind of morning sky that made you forget men were plotting horrors just below. Her death had given her something no operative ever had before: invisibility. She could move now without hesitation, without oversight. A ghost had no chains. The wind carried another burst of laughter from the valley, louder this time. She lifted her head just enough to see the thin line of smoke twisting from the compound. Men stood in clusters, rifles leaning against walls, heads tilted back in victory. Their guard was down. They believed the threat was gone. They believed wrong. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse steadied. The jagged rocks pressing into her chest became anchors, holding her still, grounding her. The fear, it was there, always there, but it was no longer sharp. It had turned into something colder, cleaner: determination. She remembered something one of her instructors had said during SEAL training. The words had stuck with her, even when everything else had blurred in sweat and exhaustion. When the mission ends, you'll know. Until then, you don't get to quit. Her mission wasn't over, not yet. And if that meant walking back into the fire with nothing but a knife and her will, then that was what she would do. The rocks shifted under her as she pushed up slowly, wincing at the stab in her leg. She reached for her last grenade, weighing it in her palm, feeling its promise of chaos. Her other hand brushed over the survival kit strapped at her side: the wire cutters, the beacon, the bloodied bandages. Tools of someone not yet willing to die. Above, the sun broke fully over the ridge, spilling light across her torn uniform, across the mud and blood smeared into her skin. Avery Rogers was dead. The world believed it. The enemy celebrated it. Her own command had written it into the record. But in the shadows of the mountain, Avery Rogers was alive. And she was about to prove that sometimes death was the perfect cover. What kind of soldier walks into a fortress alone, with nothing left to lose? The question pressed into Avery's chest as the night settled over the valley. Shadows stretched across the compound below, breaking into long black stripes that cut the dirt roads into pieces. Lanterns burned at the guard posts. Rifles hung lazy over shoulders. The men who thought they had killed her were settling into routine, blind to the truth crawling in their midst. She had watched them for hours from a higher ridge, timing rotations, memorizing blind spots. Weeks of reconnaissance had taught her the rhythms of this place, the way men drifted toward coffee fires, the way eyes wandered just long enough between sweeps. Tonight, those rhythms would become her doorway. Her knife rested warm in her palm, the steel more intimate than the rifle she had lost. A weapon like that spoke in whispers, not in thunder. It demanded patience, precision. Mercy cut out of the equation. The plan was simple because it had to be. Slip through the perimeter, reach the command building, gather evidence of the planned attacks, and disable what she could. Simplicity didn't mean safety. It meant survival rested on one truth: she could not be seen. She started down the slope. Every step was a test of silence. Gravel shifted under her boots, and she froze until the sound blended with the wind. The mountain air was thin, sharp, clawing at her lungs, but her body moved like it remembered something deeper than exhaustion. It remembered discipline. It remembered purpose. At the outer fence, the first obstacle loomed, razor wire stretched taut, its glint faint beneath the half-moon. A tower sat 30 meters away, a lone guard sweeping his rifle light across the dirt in lazy arcs. Avery's eyes locked on him, counting. 1, 2, 3, 45 seconds of inattentive routine, a window she could slide into. When his beam swung wide, she slipped forward, belly to the dirt, wire cutters working slow and steady. Each snip felt louder than gunfire, but the guard never turned. She slid through the opening and pressed flat against the ground inside the compound. The smell hit her first: diesel, gun oil, sweat. A place alive with men who thought war was something they controlled. She let the sense burn into her, reminding her of the stakes. Every rifle cleaned here meant another market bombed. Every crate of ammunition stacked here meant another family ripped apart. She moved between shadows, spine pressed to walls, eyes catching every detail. A pair of guards laughed at a doorway, one leaning his rifle against the frame. Their voices floated rough and careless. She slid closer, knife angled low. The man turned his head at the wrong second. Her hand covered his mouth. The blade found the soft hollow under his jaw. He sagged into her arms with a shudder. The other turned, eyes wide, but she was already there, the steel flashing once, clean, final. They crumpled in silence. She eased them into the dark, arranging their bodies to look like two men slumped in careless sleep. A flicker of guilt tried to rise, but she smothered it. These men weren't farmers pressed into service. They weren't boys with fear in their eyes. They were architects of slaughter, and mercy for them meant cruelty for their victims. Her breath caught as she reached the side of the command building. Through the windows, dim light spilled across maps, radios, and charts scrawled with targets. She could see them, the leaders, heads bent over the table, lips moving fast. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The red markers stabbing at airports, schools, bus depots told her enough. She had to get inside. Her pulse slowed as she studied the door rotation. 2 guards at the entrance. One circled every 2 minutes. That left 90 seconds when only one man stood. She waited, pressed flat against the wall, counting each beat of her heart. When the second guard turned the corner, she moved. The sentry barely registered her shadow before the knife silenced him. She caught his weight, dragged him out of sight, and pressed herself against the wood. A deep breath steadied her hand as she twisted the handle. The door gave way. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and sweat. Maps spread across the table, marked with lines that stretched across 3 continents. Europe, the Middle East, Africa, airports circled in red, schools underlined. Shopping centers slashed with arrows. It wasn't one attack. It was many. A web of chaos designed to stretch governments thin, to terrify civilians into silence. Avery pulled the camera from her kit, snapping photos in rapid succession. Each click was another life saved, though no one outside this room would ever know her name. The leaders inside the adjoining chamber spoke in hushed urgency, their silhouettes shifting. Time was running out. Her hands shook as she captured the rosters, names, faces, coordinates. The scale of it made her stomach knot. Thousands of deaths, maybe tens of thousands, written into these papers like numbers on a balance sheet. Her throat tightened with rage. Then came the sound. A door slammed in the distance. Boots pounded against tile. Shouts cut through the night, sharp, panicked. She froze. Someone had found the missing guards. Alarms wailed, piercing and brutal. Red lights splashed against the walls. The compound roared to life. She stuffed the camera back into her kit and reached for her rifle and stopped. It wasn't there. Her HK-416 was gone. All she had was the pistol holstered at her thigh, the knife in her palm, and the grenades that could end everything. Her choice narrowed in a single heartbeat. She could try to run, to cut back through the fence and disappear into the dark. Or she could stay, finish what she had started, and risk never seeing another sunrise. Her jaw clenched. Running meant the network lived. It meant the plans on the table would be carried out. Innocent blood on her conscience. She couldn't let that happen, not now, not ever. Her breath came steady now, almost calm. She pulled the pistol free, checked the chamber, and melted deeper into the shadows of the command center. The first man through the door never saw her. 2 shots whispered into his chest. He fell without a cry. Another burst in, rifle raised, shouting in the harsh language of orders. Her knife flashed once across his throat. The spray painted the maps red. She moved like she had always dreamed she would in the endless drills of training, fluid, precise, invisible. Not a soldier now, but something else. Something colder. Something that moved through chaos with the calm certainty of death. The shouts grew louder. More boots, more rifles. The walls shook with the thud of men rushing through corridors. She planted charges at the communications center, her hands quick, deliberate. One at the radio bank. One at the weapons cache she had seen near the back wall. She had little left, but what she had would tear the heart out of this place. Through the noise, she heard it again, her own voice in her mind, repeating the words that had defined her choice. The mission isn't over until the threat is gone. A crash tore through the room as a squad burst in. Rifles lifted, muzzles sparking. Bullets ripped the table, tore through maps, shattered glass. Avery dove behind the steel desk, returning fire in measured bursts. One fell, then another. But the rest kept coming, their voices rising in rage. Her pistol clicked dry, empty. She drew the knife again, lungs burning. This was it, the edge she had always known she'd face one day. The edge where skill met exhaustion, where determination met mortality. And yet, in that moment, she wasn't afraid. She was alive in a way no one had ever been. She was fighting not for orders, not for country, but for the faceless families who would never know her name, for the children sleeping in cities who would never hear the explosion she had just prevented. The charge timer blinked red, 30 seconds. Avery's lips curved, almost a smile. Not of victory, not of pride, but of release. The ground shook as the first explosion ripped through the communications hub. A roar of fire swallowed the compound. Men screamed, shadows twisting in chaos. The weapons cache went next, the fireball blasting through walls, tearing apart everything these men had built. Avery ran through smoke, body low, wounds screaming but her will dragging her forward. Fire painted the night orange. Her mission, her impossible, solitary mission, was finally breaking their network apart piece by piece. But it wasn't over, not yet. A shot rang out. Pain tore across her shoulder, hot and blinding. She stumbled, crashed into the dirt. Her pistol spun away. Her body screamed to stay down, but her hand pressed to the wound, dragging her up again, forcing one more step. Because if she stopped now, it would all have been for nothing. How far can one body go before it finally breaks? The question wasn't new to Avery Rogers. She had asked it before, on the long runs in SEAL training that left recruits vomiting in the sand, during drown-proofing drills where water pressed like iron against her lungs, on nights when bruises and exhaustion had made her doubt she belonged among the men who had doubted her from the start. But never had the answer mattered more than now. Smoke clawed the night sky behind her, thick and black, glowing orange at its base where the compound burned. Explosions thudded in waves, secondary charges cooking off inside the weapons stores. Screams cut through the crackle of fire, then choked into silence. She had turned their victory feast into an inferno. But her blood was soaking the dirt. The sniper's round had chewed into her shoulder, tearing muscle, leaving her arm heavy and clumsy. Her thigh burned where another bullet had grazed her, leaving a crimson trail behind every step. She had made it past the first ring of buildings, crawling through the smoke like a shadow, but the open ground loomed ahead, 30 meters of nothing but dirt and shattered concrete. Behind her, voices rose in fury. Orders barked. Boots pounded. They were hunting her now, and they would not stop until the ghost who had haunted them was finally silenced. Avery pressed herself flat against a drainage ditch, chest heaving, and forced her mind to clear. Panic would get her killed. Pain was irrelevant. Training was all that mattered. One breath in, one out, focus. Her hand brushed the survival kit at her belt. Razor wire cutters, small med supplies, one last grenade. She couldn't fight them head-on, not now, but she could outthink them, outlast them. She had before. She slid forward in the ditch, mud slick beneath her fingers until she reached the fence. The wire gleamed faint in the firelight, razor edges cruel and mocking. Her shoulder screamed as she pulled the cutters, every squeeze sending shocks of pain down her arm. Snip, snip. Each cut felt like thunder, but the shouts behind her grew more distant, their confusion giving her the sliver of time she needed. She wriggled through, the wire biting into her back, tearing fabric and skin. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. On the far side, she rolled into the rocks, pressing her body against the earth as searchlights swept across the yard she had just left. Free but not safe. Her breathing came ragged, shallow. She could feel warmth sliding down her side, the steady leak of blood. Each drop left a marker for those who would follow. She knew the rule: wounded meant slow. Slow meant dead. Still, her legs moved, one dragging, one pushing, carrying her up the slope away from the flames. The mountain loomed above like a wall, jagged and merciless. She climbed anyway. Every step bought her another heartbeat. Every heartbeat meant the mission lived. Behind her, the compound's fury echoed through the valley. Men shouted her name like a curse. Gunfire cracked into the dark, blind and desperate. She smiled, though her lips were cracked and bloody. They didn't know. They thought they had flushed her out, but the truth was simple. She was already gone. Her strength faltered an hour later. She collapsed into a narrow ravine, chest pounding, vision swimming. The sky above was pale with stars, so bright it almost hurt to look. For a moment she lay still, pressing torn fabric against her shoulder to slow the bleeding. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to her family. Her mother's hands at the kitchen table, her father's medals locked in a dusty box he never opened. The last time she had seen them, she had promised she would come back. But did that promise still count if she was already dead in their eyes? She bit back the thought. Emotions were dangerous here. They slowed the hands, blurred the eyes. She couldn't afford them. Her radio crackled weakly at her side, the emergency beacon flickering. She raised it, voice trembling but clear. Nightfall 7, mission complete, intelligence transmitted, cell neutralized, tell my family I completed the mission. Her thumb hovered, then pressed send. A burst transmission fired into the dark, a digital flare that might reach friendly hands or be swallowed by static. She lowered the beacon, throat tight. If this was the end, at least the mission had lived. At least thousands would live. But the fire inside her refused to dim. She forced herself up, legs trembling, and moved deeper into the ravine. Each step was agony, but each step was also proof. Proof that death had not claimed her yet. Proof that she could still fight. Hours bled into dawn. Pale light spread across the peaks, turning the sky soft and merciless. The world looked almost peaceful, as if the valley below weren't still burning with death. Her body gave out at last. She collapsed into a cave, dragging herself inside with the last of her strength. Rocks pressed against her wounds, the taste of copper thick in her mouth. She let herself slip into blackness, unsure if she would ever wake. When she did, 3 days had passed. The pain was worse, sharper, but dulled by the strange calm that came with survival. She had bound her wounds with what little she had, drinking from a stream that trickled nearby. Hunger gnawed, but she ignored it. She had ignored worse. Voices carried faintly into the cave. She crawled to the edge, listening. Arabic, orders, laughter. The enemy had returned to the valley, trying to rebuild, trying to salvage what she had destroyed. They thought the American operative was dead. They thought their nightmare had ended. They were wrong again. Avery lay back against the stone, eyes burning with fever and resolve. She could leave now, hide, wait for rescue. She had done more than anyone could have asked. She had bought time. But time wasn't enough, not when she had seen their maps, not when she had heard their plans. Her death was still her cover. They would not expect her. They would not see her coming. The mission wasn't over, not until every last ember of their network was crushed to ash. The ghost had survived the fire. Now she would become the storm that followed. What happens when the enemy celebrates too soon? The question lingered in the air as Avery lay on her stomach at the cave's mouth, binoculars pressed to her eyes. Below, in the valley she had left burning days before, the terrorists were rebuilding. Trucks rolled in. Men carried crates. Shouts rang across the smoldering ruins. The smoke had thinned, but the stench of fire still clung like a scar. They thought they were safe. Safe because the American who had ripped through their compound was gone. Safe because her death had been recorded and confirmed. Avery almost smiled. Death had become her shield. Her shoulder still burned, the bandages stiff with dried blood. Her leg throbbed with each shift of her weight. Hunger hollowed her stomach and fever gnawed the edges of her thoughts, but none of that mattered now. Pain was background noise. Suffering was irrelevant. She had seen their maps. She had heard their plans. She knew what they were rebuilding wasn't just a base, but a network. A machine that, if allowed to run again, would bleed across borders. And as long as she drew breath, she could not allow that. For days she watched. She tracked routines, counted men, marked vehicles. She learned which leaders barked orders and which ones listened. She saw the smugness on their faces, the confidence that no American shadow haunted their walls anymore. At night, fever dreams came, flashes of her training, the cold water of drown-proofing pulling her under, the sand of Coronado grinding into her skin, instructors screaming until her voice broke. But when she woke, the fear was gone. In its place was clarity, purpose. They believed she was dead, and in a way they were right. Avery Rogers, the soldier, was gone. What remained was something harder to define, something that belonged more to silence than to life. The first strike was simple. She waited until midnight when laughter drifted from the supply building. 2 guards leaned against crates, rifles slung, their heads tipped back in careless ease. They thought the mountains belonged to them. They didn't see the shadow that slid through the dirt behind them, silent as a breath. Her knife moved fast, precise. One man sagged forward, the other barely had time to gasp. She dragged them into the dark, their blood soaking into soil already stained a dozen times over. She slipped inside the building. Crates stacked high, stenciled in foreign lettering. Ammunition, explosives, the veins that would feed attacks across the world. She placed her charges where the wood was driest, where the fuel drums leaned too close. When the blast came minutes later, it rolled like thunder across the valley. Flames leapt into the night. Men shouted, rifles raised in panic, scattering like ants. She was already gone, slipping back into the rocks, eyes cold, heart steady. The second strike came 2 nights later. A radio shack perched on the edge of camp, wires trailing like veins. Through her scope, she watched men tapping codes, sending messages that carried instructions to cells far away. She waited until the guard rotation left the shack briefly unprotected, then crawled through the dirt, slow as tide. Inside, the operators never turned. One was smoking, leaning back, bored. The other hunched over the set, scribbling on paper. Her silenced pistol spoke twice, sharp whispers in the dark. Two bodies slumped. She rifled through the notes, eyes catching coordinates, times, names. Proof of a network sprawling larger than Command had imagined. She snapped photos with her battered camera, then set her charges on the equipment. The explosion tore through the valley again, shattering communications, cutting them off from their allies. By the time men arrived, she was gone, a ghost in the hills. Each night after that, she struck again. A safe house torched, a convoy ambushed, a weapons cache detonated. Each attack left them bleeding, scrambling, shouting to shadows. Each time they swore she was gone, each time they told themselves it was chance, not the hand of the dead operative. And each time the truth clawed deeper into their fear. They were being hunted. She heard it in their voices one dawn, when she slipped close enough to catch a conversation near a fire. One man whispered in disbelief, his words sharp with dread. "She's dead. I saw the report. I heard it myself." "Then tell me," the other hissed, eyes scanning the mountains, "who is killing us now?" The silence between them was sweeter than any victory. Fear had become her ally. But fear wasn't enough. She needed more than panic. She needed to cut out the heart. The new command post lay 5 kilometers from the ruins of the old compound. Larger, cleaner, less makeshift. She studied it for 2 days, her fever slowly fatting, her strength returning in stubborn fragments. 15 fighters guarded it, too focused on radios and screens to notice the cracks in their own defenses. She crawled closer each night, mapping routes, memorizing blind spots. When the 8th night came, she was ready. She slid through the dirt, every movement slow, deliberate, her body a machine of silence. The first building she entered smelled of fuel and sweat. 2 men slept on mats. They never woke. One by one, she moved through the compound. Her knife was efficient, her pistol cold. No noise, no mercy. By the time she reached the command room, her hands were slick, her breath steady. The door cracked open. Inside, men spoke into cameras, their faces lit by screens showing allies far away. She caught their words, targets named, dates set, attacks resurrected from the ashes she thought she had already killed. Rage burned steady in her chest. She stepped inside, pistol raised. The men turned, shock flashing across their faces. For a second they froze, disbelief pinning them to their chairs. She moved before they could breathe. One shot, then another. Then another. Each man fell where he sat, eyes wide with the impossible truth. The ghost was real. But the cameras still rolled. On the screens across half a dozen feeds, leaders in other cities stared at her. Their voices tangled in chaos, shouting in fear. She looked at them, calm, steady, her pistol still raised. And for the first time she spoke. "This is what happens to people who target civilians. Your networks are broken. Your leaders are dead. Your time is over." The words weren't for her enemies. They were for history. She snapped photos of the screens, the faces, the locations scrawled across notepads. Then she yanked the wires free, smashing equipment, planting her last charges. The blast shook the mountains, sending fire curling into the sky once again. By the time the survivors stumbled through smoke, coughing, eyes wide, Avery was gone, her shadow swallowed into the night. For 4 days she hunted without rest. Every safe house she had mapped, every convoy she had marked, every cache she had seen, one by one, she destroyed them. Fire followed her steps, smoke marking the sky in grim testimony. By the end of the week, the network was shattered. Men who had once spoken of striking across 3 continents now whispered like hunted animals. And still they asked the same question, over and over, voices trembling in the dark. How do you kill someone who's already dead? Avery never answered. She didn't need to. How do you explain a miracle to the people who buried you on paper? The question hung in the quiet of the ravine like smoke. Avery had expected the world to notice sooner, the burst transmission she'd sent days ago, the photos injected into the ether, the destruction that had ripped the heart from a network, but official channels had their rhythms, and those rhythms were slow, stubborn things. She had learned to be patient. She had learned to wait for silence to crack where it had to. When the beacon finally answered, it was not the triumphant rush she had imagined. It was a radio crackle and a voice filtered through government bureaucracy, buffered by disbelief and static. Nightfall 7 Overwatch. We're showing your beacon signal, but our records indicate KIA. Confirm identity. She had sat against a rock, the desert sun flensing the air above her, fingers numb and stained with weeks of grime. Her wounds had healed into angry ridges, her shoulder ached like a hand that would never let go, and the hollow in her belly had become a constant companion. But when the radio spoke, something inside her tightened. She answered because there was no other course left to her. Overwatch, Nightfall 7. Mission objectives complete. Request extraction and debriefing. I have intelligence requiring immediate action. There was a pause long enough for her to imagine the worst, to count the ways the world might refuse her the simple fact of being alive. Then the voice came back, raw with the mixture of relief and incredulity that has to be heard to be believed. Nightfall 7. Confirm you are alive and mission capable. Avery let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Affirmative, very much alive, mission complete, ready to come home. 12 hours later they found her where she had said she'd be, sitting quiet and steady beside a cache of ruined weapons and a pile of intelligence packets, as if she had been waiting for a pickup for 3 days like any other routine op. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kine approached like a man seeing a ghost and doing his best to keep his hands steady. "Rogers," he said, and the way his voice broke between surprise and a soldier's curiosity told her everything. "By our records, you've been dead for 2 weeks." She stood slowly, testing her legs in the sunlight. Pain flared and then subsided into a familiar ache. "They left me for dead, Chief. I figured I'd return the favor." She kept her tone light, the old soldier's reflex to make a joke in the face of absurdity. It landed like a pebble in a lake. The ripples were small, but they were real. Chief Kine looked at the wreckage, at the scorched earth and the smoldering crates, then back at her. "Rogers, what you did here, this is beyond special operations. This is something else." She wanted to tell him about the nights in which she'd talked to herself to stave off madness, about the ache of being invisible in every official ledger, about the way memory kept folding politicians, memos into prayerful pleas. She wanted to tell him about her mother's hands and her father's dusty medals that had kept her awake more than once. But those things were private griefs, and in the face of debriefing and protocol, they seemed small as ration packs. Instead, she said what she always said when someone tried to turn her into a legend. Mission complete, all objectives achieved. It was true. It was everything. It did not need embellishment. They flew home with the sun dipping red behind the mountains, and for a while Avery let herself feel something like exhaustion rather than the coiled alertness that had sustained her for weeks. The aircraft hummed with the tired silence of men who have seen too much and speak too little. Around her, the faces were a map of disbelief. Fellow operators, intel officers, a medical tech scribbling notes with hands that didn't quite look like they belonged to a man who'd seen what she'd seen. The debriefing that followed was the slow, meticulous unspooling of everything she had done. That's the way it always is. You give the facts, the dry bones of the operation, and the rest, the throbbing, the cost, the moral calculus, they nod and file it away. But in this case, those facts were explosives. A single operative had collapsed a multinational threat. The higher-ups had to decide what to make of that without making it mean too much publicly. Denial, they called it. Plausibility. Deniability. Admiral Catherine Morrison sat at the head of the room, her posture the kind of rigid calm that made uniforms straighter. She had the look of someone who had not been surprised by anything in a long time, until Avery began to speak. Then the look shifted, just a fraction, curiosity threading through duty. "Rogers," the Admiral said, voice cropped and precise. "You were KIA in our files. Why did you continue? Why not follow standard operating procedure? We have rules for a reason." Avery met her gaze. In those eyes she saw not accusation but the hunger of someone who wanted to understand an anomaly. "Ma'am," she said, and the words measured themselves into steel, "the mission wasn't finished. I saw what they were planning. If I'd waited for extraction, those plans would have moved forward. Thousands would have died. My orders said survive and extract. My conscience said stop them." There was no righteous flourish in her words, no chest-thumping bravado, just the cold arithmetic that had pushed her through those nights, the calculus of lives saved versus orders obeyed. Admiral Morrison listened. When she asked follow-ups about chain of command, about who knew, about why the radio had stopped, Avery answered with the practical detail of someone who had spent weeks living by maps and habit. Later in private, the Admiral asked a question that landed like a stone. "Rogers, do you regret what you did?" The question surprised her because it was simple and human, and not at all a question about doctrine. Avery felt the old ache that always came when she remembered faces she'd seen die, not their end, but the consequences of a life spent ordering other lives. "Regret," she said slowly. "I regret that they were men at all. I regret that we're ever forced to trade bodies for peace. But I don't regret that I stopped them. If regret means letting those people live to crush others, I'll accept the cost." The Admiral sat with it, then nodded as if she had expected nothing less. There was the silence between them that contained orders not yet spoken and policies not yet written. The official channels were less generous. There were memos about protocol, quiet meetings in rooms that did not have windows, and the subtle repositioning of narratives. The government likes tidy stories. This one was messy, an operator declared dead, then returning with the bodies that proved she had not been. It didn't fit neatly into press releases or congressional hearings. So they did what governments do with inconvenient truths. They classified it. They folded it into a file that would be whispered about in secure rooms and used as a legend when needed. Avery sat through it all with a surprising calm. She had known the cost. The reality of becoming an instrument of deniability was not glamorous. It was a life lived between reports, a role where the world would sometimes need her and sometimes forget she existed. She had already lived that life in the ravine. The nights after the debrief were worse. It wasn't that she had nightmares, she had expected those, but that the quiet felt like a new kind of enemy. All those small human things she had missed while surviving began to press on her. The sound of a phone she could no longer answer with a lie, the scent of laundry that smelled like someone who expected her to be home. Her mother called once and left a message that was equal parts worry and pride. Avery listened to it 3 times before letting it loop into emptiness. They offered her a choice, public recognition and medals, or confidentiality, and a role shaping what had become of her approach. The world wanted a hero and her handlers wanted a ghost. Both offers tasted like compromise. She had never been one for ceremonies. The medals would sit on a table, shiny and awkward. The secrecy might keep her from being asked to do things no one would ever admit. In the end, she chose neither with outright enthusiasm, and both with the weary acceptance of someone who knew the price of either choice. She agreed to brief a small contingent, to teach what she had learned about posthumous operations and how an operative's death could be weaponized against those who believed they had won. They called it phantom operations in the later notes, an ugly technical term for something raw and ancient, using the assumption of an end as a doorway to continue fighting. Avery trained a few, picking ones who had the stubbornness to work alone and the moral center to use that isolation without losing themselves. Training was its own kind of therapy. She taught the cold skills, survival under the assumption of death, silent infiltration, living off what the earth would give you clumsily. And she also insisted on the small things no one else ever taught. How to keep your humanity when no one witnesses it. How to make a quiet account of the faces you save so they don't become numbers. how to send messages home should you fall. Those lessons were harder. They were the ones that bent her students into people who could live with their choices. But even as she taught, she was haunted by a different toll, the way the world had rearranged itself to accommodate the possibility of invisible wars. There were nights she woke in cold sweats, memories flaring back like old fires. Sometimes, she would sit in the quiet of the barracks and count the ways she had crossed lines she had sworn never to cross. Other times, she would find herself laughing with colleagues over something so small it fractured the tension for a second, and she would realize laughing was a muscle she had forgotten how to use. A quiet day came when she was asked to write a short note for a file, recommendations on how to choose operatives for phantom missions. She wrote with a precise hand, nodding psychological resilience, moral compass, and an odd addendum, the ability to forgive oneself. It was the only place she allowed herself to say out loud that the cost of such operations could consume the people who did them if they didn't have a way to come home inside themselves. Months later, when analysts tried to explain why so many cells had crumbled in such a short time, they pulled at threads and found nothing. No official action, no diplomatic pressure, no public strike, just quiet disappearances and failed plots. In some places, rumors of a ghost soldier took hold. In others, governments quietly credited intelligence they would never show. The truth lived in classified files with stamps only the president could read. For Avery, the truth was simpler and harder all at once. She had been declared dead, and in that declaration she found the freedom to finish what had been started. She had paid the price of operating without oversight, of making decisions no one could stand behind publicly. She had taken lives and saved many more. That was the ledger she kept. Sometimes, late at night when the world felt thin as paper, she would read a letter from a family that thanked her anonymously for a life she had saved. She would fold it, breathe in the ordinary paper smell, and feel something like peace. Small things, perhaps, but enough. If you asked her what the moral of her story was, she would avoid the grand pronouncements. She had learned that in war, choices are rarely clean, that sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and that survival, when tethered to purpose, can become a strange kind of grace. The rest of the world would call her many things behind locked doors. She learned to live with that. The important part was not the name they gave her. It was the quiet knowledge that somewhere, people breathed a little easier because she had chosen not to be quiet forever. What do you do with a soldier who refuses to stay dead? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the one echoing through conference rooms layered with secrecy, where admirals and generals sat stiff-backed under fluorescent lights, trying to make sense of Avery Rogers. For weeks, she had been studied, debriefed, asked the same questions 100 different ways. How had she survived? How had she kept fighting? Why hadn't she stopped when orders told her to? The answers were simple, though no one seemed ready to believe them. Survival came down to training, instinct, and willpower. Fighting came from knowing what the enemy planned and refusing to let it happen. And stopping would have meant betrayal not of her country, not even of her orders, but of the children in airports, the families in schools, the travelers in marketplaces who would have been slaughtered if she had chosen obedience over conscience. But truth and military policy were rarely comfortable together. In those rooms, men and women debated in clipped tones whether she was a hero or a liability, a precedent or a problem. They spoke of operational irregularities, of command deviations. They danced around the word insubordination, but no one could argue with the results. One operator, declared dead, had dismantled what would have taken coalitions months, maybe years. And that was what terrified them most. Avery sat through it with the calm patience of someone who had already faced worse than bureaucratic skepticism. She answered their questions. She relived the firefights in detail. She explained how she had rationed her strength, how she had turned her own obituary into camouflage. But when they asked why she did it, her answer never changed. The mission wasn't over. Sometimes that silenced them. Sometimes it made them angry. But always it left the truth hanging between them. She had accomplished something they couldn't put back in a box. One afternoon, after hours of sterile interrogation, Admiral Morrison broke the silence with a statement that changed the direction of every conversation that followed. "Rogers," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the table, "you've proven something none of us considered before. Sometimes the most effective operator is the one the enemy believes is gone." The room had gone still, papers rustled, pens froze above notepads, and just like that a seed was planted. Avery didn't set out to change doctrine. She hadn't thought about inventing a new way of fighting wars. She had simply refused to die when everyone else had written her off. But in the shadowed corners of intelligence agencies, her actions were already being shaped into something bigger, the foundation of ghost missions. The premise was simple, brutal, and effective. Use the presumed death of an operative as cover. Strip away the weight of oversight, of politics, of visibility. Give them freedom no living soldier could have. Let them operate in the gray space between memory and myth, where enemies lower their guard and governments deny knowledge. The implications were staggering. For Avery, it meant long nights wrestling with herself. She had seen what freedom from oversight gave her, the ability to save thousands. But she had also felt the weight of choices made alone, in silence, with no one to share the cost. Was it a gift or a curse? She couldn't decide. In her quieter moments, she remembered the cave where she had lain bleeding, listening to enemy voices echo in the valley, knowing her command had written her off. She remembered the hollow ache of knowing her family believed she was gone. To live as a ghost meant accepting that loneliness as a permanent companion. Could anyone else survive that? Could they hold their humanity intact when stripped of every anchor? Those were the questions she carried into the training hall when they asked her to teach. The first time she stood in front of the small group selected for phantom operations, she saw faces younger than hers, harder than hers, eager in ways that made her chest tighten. She didn't see soldiers. She saw children who hadn't yet learned what it meant to be forgotten. She told them the truth. This isn't about tactics. You all know tactics. This isn't about shooting straighter or moving faster. It's about carrying silence inside you, about being ready to operate when no one knows your name, when your command doesn't acknowledge your existence, when the only validation you'll ever get is the breath of people who don't even know you saved them. If you can't live with that, walk out now. None of them moved. Pride burned in their eyes, pride in something harder. She hoped it would be enough. Her lessons were practical, brutal, and unvarnished. How to send fragments of intelligence without revealing survival. How to stretch calories until hunger became part of the bloodstream. How to manage wounds with nothing but a knife and cloth. How to speak to yourself in the dark so madness doesn't creep in. But she also taught them things doctrine had never considered. How to remember faces instead of numbers. How to let grief pass through you without drowning in it. How to forgive yourself when the line between survival and morality blurred. Because it would blur. It always did. Some nights after the trainees had gone, she sat alone in the empty hall, her knife resting on her thigh, staring at the reflection of herself in the window. She hardly recognized the woman there. Not the soldier, not the operative, not even the ghost. Just a human being trying to make sense of survival that had become myth. Did she regret it? Sometimes. Did she wish she had followed orders? Never. Because regret, she had learned, is about wishing you had chosen differently. And she couldn't imagine a world where she had chosen not to act. Outside the classified facilities, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Travelers moved through airports unaware their safety had been purchased by a woman buried in paperwork as deceased. Children went to school never knowing their laughter had been protected by a soldier who had bled alone in a ravine. Markets bustled, governments argued, life moved on. That was the point. That was the reward, to fight so that others never had to know. Sometimes, though, Avery would walk through a city street, hood pulled low, blending into crowds, and feel the quiet ache of invisibility. People brushed past her, laughing, arguing, living ordinary lives. None of them knew. None of them would. She told herself that was enough, but on the loneliest nights she wasn't sure. The program grew, shaped by her lessons, refined by those who followed. Missions no one admitted to began to succeed quietly. Threats evaporated before they materialized. Cells disbanded, leaders vanished, plans never came to life. Analysts puzzled over the disappearances. Politicians accepted the quiet and moved on. The world never connected the dots. And Avery Rogers, the ghost who had refused to die, watched from the shadows as her accidental rebellion became doctrine. The irony never left her. She had broken the rules to save lives, and in doing so, she had written new ones. Rules that demanded men and women live half-existences, carrying the burden of silence forever. Sometimes she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her quarters, asking herself if she had done the right thing, if unleashing this path had saved more than it had damned. The answer never came. It hovered in the silence, unanswered, maybe unanswerable. But every time doubt gnawed too deeply, she remembered the maps on those tables, the red circles drawn over airports, schools, markets. She remembered the children who would have died, and she told herself it had been worth it, even if it meant she would never again be just Avery Rogers. She was something else now, something nameless. And ghosts, she had learned, don't get to rest. How long can a person live as a shadow before they disappear into it? The question had begun to haunt Avery as the years pressed forward. Missions came and went. Trainees became operators, operators became whispers, and through it all, her name remained buried beneath classification stamps and redacted lines. She had lived longer in silence than she ever had in recognition. Sometimes she thought about that, about how, in official records, she had died in the mountains years ago, about how birthdays, anniversaries, even ordinary moments no longer existed on paper. To the world, Avery Rogers had been buried before her 30th year. Everything since had been something else entirely, something unacknowledged, something that could never be admitted. And yet the world bore the marks of her work. A terrorist convoy disappearing in the desert with no explanation. A planned bombing at a European airport unraveling because the cell never arrived. A financier found dead in his safe house, his plans shredded in a fire that was never traced. One by one, operations the world had feared simply evaporated. In intelligence communities, theories grew. Some said a new technology had been deployed. Some whispered about foreign interference. Others, lower ranking with ears closer to rumor, spoke of a woman who had died and refused to stay buried. The ghost. Avery heard it once indirectly when an analyst on the edge of clearance whispered to another, thinking she couldn't hear. They say she's a myth, a phantom, one of ours who never made it home. She hunts what no one else can touch. A myth. She wanted to laugh, and sometimes she did soft, bitter laughter in the privacy of her quarters. A myth was cleaner than reality. Myths didn't limp from wounds that never healed properly. Myths didn't wake in the night, drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Myths didn't wonder if their family still set a place for them at Christmas, or if their mother still wept at a photograph that had never been updated. No, myths lived easier lives. Avery Rogers lived the harder one. Her students saw it in glimpses. She taught them silence, resilience, the art of fighting after death. They respected her, maybe even revered her. But sometimes in the shadows of their eyes she caught something else, fear. Not of her skills, not of her temper, but of what she represented. She was proof of what their path demanded. Proof that if they followed where she led, they too might one day cease to exist in the world of the living, trading names for whispers, trading faces for shadows. One night, after a particularly grueling training exercise, one of the younger operatives lingered behind. His voice cracked when he asked it, but his eyes held steady. "Ma'am, how do you come back?" She had stared at him for a long time, weighing the truth. Then softly she said, "You don't. You find a way to live inside the silence, and if you're lucky, you make peace with it." The boy had nodded, but she knew the answer carved fear deeper into him. And maybe that was for the best. Ghost work wasn't for the proud or the reckless. It was for those who understood sacrifice not as a word, but as a way of life. Still, on nights when the base was quiet, and she found herself walking past windows that reflected her face back at her, Avery wondered if she had spoken truth, or simply given him the only answer she could bear. Years passed in fragments, measured not by holidays or milestones, but by missions completed and networks dismantled. Avery became less a soldier and more a presence. The people she trained carried her techniques into places she would never set foot, using her lessons to fracture cells she would never see. But her own work never stopped. She still operated when asked, sometimes alone, sometimes guiding others. Each time she carried the same ritual, a quiet breath before moving, a reminder that no one outside those walls would ever know she had been there. It was a life built on erasure. And yet, despite the silence, she found herself confronted by proof that her work mattered. Intelligence reports came back thinner each year. Threats diminished. Networks collapsed before they grew. Families walked freely in markets where fear once gripped them. Children slept without the echo of explosions in their dreams. No one thanked her because no one knew, and perhaps that was how it should be. But inside her, the ledger grew heavier. There were nights when she closed her eyes and saw the faces of those she had killed, not because she doubted their guilt, but because she could never forget the moment a life ended at her hand. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was justice. And still, the weight never lifted. The only balance came in the memory of those maps, those plans, those red circles scrawled over innocent lives. She carried them like armor. Each time doubt pierced her chest, she wrapped herself in the knowledge of what she had prevented. Still, the loneliness was sharper than any wound. Sometimes she dreamed of home. She dreamed of sitting at her mother's kitchen table, of hearing her father's voice cut through silence like it once had. But each time she reached for it, the dream fractured into smoke, because Avery Rogers was still dead, and the dead didn't come home. What did it mean to live in that space? To walk the earth but belong nowhere, to breathe but never to exist? She wasn't sure anymore. Her legend grew without her help. She heard pieces of it in briefings, in rumors carried by green recruits. A woman who walked through fire and came back without a scar. A ghost who could not be killed. A phantom who dismantled entire networks with nothing but a knife and silence. The truth was messier. The scars were real. The limp in her step was permanent. And every mission cost her another piece of the humanity she tried so hard to protect. But perhaps myths needed to be clean. Perhaps the world needed a ghost more than it needed the flawed, wounded woman behind the story. She thought about that often, the difference between who she was and who the world believed her to be. And sometimes she wondered if, slowly, she was becoming more myth than woman. What happens when you live too long as a ghost? Do you forget the sound of your own heartbeat? Avery didn't know, but she feared the answer. And yet every time the radio crackled, every time intelligence slid across her desk, every time another threat loomed, she picked up her gear. She moved into the silence. She acted. Because whatever the cost, whatever the myth, the mission still mattered. And the mission was never truly over. How do you end a story that was never supposed to exist? The thoughts circled Avery's mind as she sat in the back of the transport, the hum of the engine steady against the silence. The mission brief lay folded in her lap, but she hadn't looked at it for an hour. She didn't need to. The pattern was familiar now. A threat that couldn't be acknowledged. A network too sensitive to confront in daylight. A problem that required a ghost to solve. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't eager. She was simply steady. Years of being erased had carved her into something the world didn't know how to name. She wasn't the soldier she had once been, standing shoulder to shoulder with her team. She wasn't the woman her family remembered, the one with laughter in her eyes and warmth in her voice. And she wasn't the myth whispered in briefing rooms, the phantom who walked out of fire unscarred. She was all of them and none of them. The mission was simple in outline, impossibly complex in execution. A safe house in a city too fragile for open warfare. Leaders gathering in secret, stitching together the remnants of networks she had already broken. It was the same story, played in different places, told by different faces. And she knew how it would end. It would end in silence. As the aircraft descended, she let herself close her eyes. She thought of water, of the cold surf of Coronado that had once threatened to drown her, and had instead taught her to live without oxygen longer than fear thought possible. She thought of the cave in the mountains where she had first woken to her own obituary. She thought of her students, the ones who carried her lessons now, who walked the same narrow edge between life and legend. And she thought of her mother, her father, her family, the people who would never know she was breathing even now. People who had learned to live with a grief that was half true and half lie. The aircraft touched down, the doors opened. Avery Rogers stepped into the night one more time. The city was alive with ordinary sounds, horns, laughter, the hum of markets still open in narrow streets. She moved through it like smoke, invisible, unseen, another face in the crowd. Her target was only blocks away, hidden behind the facade of a warehouse. Inside, men plotted with the arrogance of those who believed the threat was gone. Maps were spread, schedules marked, weapons polished. Avery slid through the shadows, every movement measured, every breath a decision. When the first man fell, he never even knew she was there. The second barely raised his head before silence claimed him. She moved through them like the ghost they believed her to be, knife and pistol speaking in whispers. The leaders at the table froze when she stepped into the light, eyes widening with recognition that could never be spoken aloud. "You thought death would stop me," she said softly, "but death was just my cover." And then the silence took them too. When the charges blew minutes later, the building folded in on itself, smoke curling into the night sky. Avery walked away with her hood pulled low, just another figure in the crowd scattering at the noise. No one knew her face. No one asked her name. Another network erased, another victory unrecorded. Back at base, the report was thin as always. Threat neutralized, intelligence secured, civilian risk eliminated. No mention of her, no signature at the bottom, just the clean efficiency of official silence. And yet in the quiet that followed, Avery felt something shift inside her. She had spent years teaching others to live without recognition, to carry the weight of sacrifice with no reward. She had told them it was worth it. That dignity lived in action, not acknowledgment. She believed it still, but she also knew that even ghosts needed rest. For the first time, she let herself imagine stepping away. Not back into the world of names and records, that life was gone forever, but into something smaller, quieter. A place where she could be a shadow not of war but of peace. A woman living in silence not because she was erased, but because she chose it. The thought didn't feel like surrender. It felt like survival of a different kind. Later, when she was called into another room, another briefing, another mission, she listened as she always did. She studied the maps, the faces, the red circles, and when they asked if she was ready, she gave the answer she always had. Yes. But in her chest, she carried something new, the knowledge that even legends could lay down their burdens, that even ghosts could find places to rest. Whether she ever would or not, she didn't know. The choice lingered ahead of her like a horizon she might one day reach. For now, the world still needed her. For now, the mission wasn't finished. And so she stepped into the night again, steady, silent, unseen. Somewhere far from the places she walked, families laughed in markets, Children slept without fear, and strangers lived unknowing of the shadow that had protected them. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because Avery Rogers had learned the truth long ago, in a ravine where her death was written into static and silence. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.